He spent his whole life believing he was unwanted. Not because no one loved him, but because the one person who did left. For years he searched for answers. But when he finally stood in front of the door that held his past, he realized some truths hurt more than abandonment itself. This is not a story about being left behind. It is a story about what happens after. The night he was abandoned, it was raining. Not the gentle kind of rain that washes the dust from streets, but the heavy, relentless kind that soaks everything it touches, until the world feels like it's been dipped in cold water and left to drip. The clouds hung low over the city, swallowing the streetlights and turning their glow into blurred halos. Water ran in thin rivers along the curb, carrying scraps of paper and leaves as if the storm itself had decided nothing should remain where it first fell. Even the air smelled different, metallic, damp, sharp, like the night was made of whetstone. She walked fast, but not confidently. A woman in a dark coat, hood pulled low, one hand clutching the fabric at her throat as if she could keep her heart from slipping out. The other arm held the child. He was light, too light for his age, his small body curled against her chest like he still believed the world was safe there. He didn't stir. His eyelashes were wet with rain, or tears, or both. His cheeks had the soft fullness of a child who hadn't yet learned what hunger really meant. But there were shadows under his eyes anyway, the kind that come from too many late nights and too many adult whispers, said too close to a child's ears. She kept looking behind her. Not like someone afraid of getting caught doing something wrong, but like someone afraid of being stopped from doing something she couldn't survive doing at all. The orphanage gate appeared through the curtain of rain like a shape pulled out of a nightmare. Tall iron bars. A small sign with letters that had faded from sun and years. A bell button mounted beside the entrance, its metal ring slick and shining under the streetlight. She halted there, breath tight, shoulders trembling. For a moment she didn't move. She just stood with the child in her arms, rain pounding the pavement around her, water sliding off her sleeves, her hood, her eyelashes. Her lips parted like she might call his name. Like she might wake him and beg him to understand a thing no 4-year-old could ever understand. But she didn't, because if she spoke, if she let sound out of her throat, she might also let out everything she'd been holding back for months. The guilt, the fear, the love that was too heavy to carry and too precious to set down. Her eyes dropped to his face. In the weak light, he looked almost unreal, peaceful, unaware. His small hand rested against her coat, fingers curled loosely as if he'd fallen asleep mid-promise. The kind of sleep that says, "You're here. You'll still be here when I wake up." A sob pressed against her chest, trying to become real. She swallowed it hard. "Baby," she whispered, anyway so faint it could have been the rain speaking through her. "I'm sorry." Her hands moved to his jacket pocket with a careful gentleness, like touching him too roughly might wake him and tear the fragile plan apart. Inside her coat, tucked close to her skin for warmth, was a folded note. The paper was creased so many times it looked tired. The ink had already smeared at the edges from the dampness of her hands. She'd written it over and over, starting again whenever the words felt too cruel, too honest, too incomplete. No version was good enough. None of them could explain abandonment in a way that didn't sound like betrayal. Still, she had to leave something. A name, a date, a reason, a plea. Or at least proof that this child had not been dropped into the world like garbage. She slid the note into his pocket slowly, then pressed the pocket flat with her palm, as if smoothing down the truth might make it less sharp. Her fingers lingered there, stubborn and desperate, refusing to let go. She touched the fabric of his sleeve, neck soft, soaked, trembling between her fingertips, and for a second she just held it, as if the sleeve were a rope and she was hanging over a cliff. As if letting go meant she would fall forever. The rain kept coming. The city kept breathing. Time did not pause for the kind of decision that cracks a person open. Her eyes lifted to the orphanage door beyond the gate. A plain door, a quiet door. The kind of door that had seen 1,000 arrivals and never asked questions out loud. A light glowed behind one of the windows. Somewhere inside, there was warmth. Dry air. People who knew how to hold a crying baby without shaking. People who might not love him the way she did. Frantic, imperfect, aching, but who could keep him alive. Her jaw clenched. She stepped forward and raised her hand to the bell. And then she stopped again. Because her mind, cruel in its timing, showed her the future in flashes. His first day of school. His first scraped knee. The first time he asked, "Where is my mom?" The first time he stopped asking because the answer hurt too much. She squeezed her eyes shut. A tear slid down her cheek and disappeared into the rain. Then she pressed the bell. Once. The sound was sharp and small, swallowed quickly by the storm. She waited. Her heartbeat thundered louder than the rain. She pressed it again. Twice. The child shifted a fraction. Brow wrinkling like a dream had briefly turned dark, but he didn't wake. He stayed folded against her chest, warm despite the cold, trusting despite everything. Somewhere inside the building, footsteps, a latch, the faint scrape of a lock being turned. Panic hit her like a physical shove. Because now it was real. Now there would be no pretending she could change her mind and walk away with him and let the whole world burn before she let him go. Her arms tightened around him once one last time, pulling him close enough that her heart could imprint itself into his ribs. She kissed his forehead through the rain, lips shaking. "I love you," she breathed, and the words broke, finally, into a sound that was almost a cry. "I love you, I love you. I love," the door clicked. She flinched at the noise like it was a gunshot. Then she moved. She opened the gate, stepped inside, set him down gently on the dry patch just beneath the awning, and arranged his small body as carefully as if she were laying him into a bed. She adjusted his jacket collar, smoothed his hair, tucked his hand against his chest. Her fingers hovered over his face for one last second, wanting to memorize every curve, every freckle, every breath. And then she ran. Not gracefully. Not quietly. She ran like someone running from a fire that had already caught her back. Her shoes slapped the wet pavement. Her breath tore out of her lungs. She didn't look back because she knew if she looked back she would stop. And if she stopped, she would not survive what she had to do next. Behind her, the door opened. A caretaker stepped into the rain, squinting into the darkness. He was an older man, shoulders thick from years of lifting children and burdens alike. His face carried the permanent exhaustion of someone who has seen too many beginnings that start with loss. He glanced left, right, only rain, only empty street. Then his eyes dropped and he saw the child. For a moment, he didn't move either. People never move right away when they see something that makes their hearts rearrange. The child stirred, confused by the new air, the cold dampness, the strange absence. The caretaker's face softened. He crouched down, careful not to startle him. "Hey there," he said gently, voice low like a blanket. "Easy, kid." The boy blinked up at him, eyes wide and dark, trying to place the missing piece, the warmth that had been holding him, the scent he'd fallen asleep against. His mouth trembled. But before the fear could fully form, the caretaker scooped him up, bringing him close to his chest, turning his body so the child wouldn't see the empty street for too long. "It's all right," the man murmured, though he had no right to promise that. "You're safe. You're safe." Rain hammered the roof above them. The city kept moving. Somewhere a car passed, tires hissing on water. Somewhere a dog barked at the storm. The caretaker carried the boy inside, into the light, into the warmth, into a building that would become the only constant in his life. On the doorstep, the wet footprints of the woman faded fast, washed away by the same rain that had hidden her leaving. Outside, the street returned to emptiness, just pavement, puddles, and the sound of the night swallowing what it didn't want to remember. By the time the caretaker stepped outside, the street was empty. Only a child, and the sound of rain. That boy would grow up never knowing her face, but he would spend his entire life feeling her absence. They gave him a name. It wasn't written on the note, because the note didn't carry a name, only a fear too heavy to spell out. So the adults chose one for him, the way people choose names when they don't expect them to matter much. A common name, easy to pronounce, easy to forget. It was written in neat ink on a folder that would follow him for years. That was how his life began again, not with a memory, but with paperwork. At first, he didn't know the name belonged to him. He only learned it after weeks of being called, "Hey," or "Come here," or "This one." When someone finally crouched down, smiled gently, and said it clearly, he looked around, confused, as if the word might be meant for someone else. Eventually, he understood. This was who he was now. He learned early not to ask questions. Not because anyone told him not to, no one ever sat him down and warned him against curiosity, but because questions had a way of making adults uncomfortable. When he asked where his mother was, voices softened too quickly, smiles came too fast. Answers became vague, unfinished. "She couldn't take care of you. She loved you, but this is a good place for you." Every sentence ended before it reached the truth. So he stopped asking. Silence, he discovered, kept people calm. Silence earned him approving nods, gentle pats on the head, remarks like, "Such a good boy." Silence made him easy to care for. And in a place filled with children competing for attention, being easy was a survival skill. Other children came and went. They arrived with trash bags and plastic suitcases, eyes wide and shoulders tight, and left with new coats, new shoes, new names waiting to be learned in new houses. The orphanage had a rhythm to it, intakes and departures, hope and loss cycling through the same hallways. When a child was adopted, the adults tried to make it feel like a celebration. They gathered everyone together. There were smiles, applause, sometimes even cake if donations had been good that month. The chosen child stood in the center, overwhelmed and glowing, holding hands with strangers who were suddenly called Mom and Dad. "Be happy for them," the adults said. So he learned how to clap. He learned how to stretch his lips into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He learned how to cheer softly, not because he felt joy, but because joy was expected of him in that moment. Inside, his chest collapsed a little each time. Not dramatically, not all at once. Just a quiet folding inward, like a chair being stacked away. At night, the building changed. The orphanage was loud during the day, voices echoing, footsteps running, doors opening and closing, but at night it became something else entirely. Shadows grew longer, sounds carried farther. The walls seemed thinner, as if secrets could slip through them. He lay in his bed staring at the ceiling, tracing the cracks with his eyes, listening. Every night he watched the door, not hoping it would open. Hope was dangerous. Hope made mornings heavier and nights unbearable. Instead, he feared what it meant that it never did. Because as the years passed, the meaning changed. At first, a closed door meant not yet. Then it meant maybe never. Eventually, it meant you are not the one they are looking for. He learned the sound of footsteps in the hallway, learned how to tell the difference between a caretaker making rounds and someone unfamiliar, someone who might be there to choose. His heart would lift despite himself, then sink again. He was never abused. No one hit him. No one screamed at him. His meals were regular. His clothes were clean. When he was sick, someone brought him medicine and checked his forehead for fever. From the outside, it was a decent life. But affection was rationed carefully, spread thin across too many children. Hugs were brief. Comfort was efficient. Love, when it appeared at all, was generalized. He was cared for. He was not chosen. No one ever came just for him. No one walked through the door and said his name with certainty. No one pointed at him and smiled like they'd been looking for him all along. No one knelt in front of him and said, "There you are." Birthdays passed quietly. Holidays came and went with donated gifts wrapped in identical paper. Teachers praised his good behavior. Caretakers called him reliable. He learned how to disappear in plain sight. He learned not to cry too loudly, not to laugh too much, not to need anything urgently. He learned how to make himself small emotionally, so that rejection wouldn't have much surface area to land on. And that kind of neglect leaves a deeper wound, because it doesn't bruise the skin or break the bones. It teaches a child something far more dangerous, that love is conditional, scarce, and meant for someone else. It teaches him to expect absence. It teaches him to live without asking. The address led nowhere at first. He stood at the corner where the paper said he should be, rainless this time, but still cold, still gray. The kind of cold that didn't bite the skin but settled deeper, into the bones, into old doubts. Cars passed without slowing. People hurried by with their collars up and their lives intact. Nothing here looked like a beginning. The street sign didn't match the note. The numbers skipped where his address should have been. The buildings, if they had ever existed, were gone. In their place stood newer walls, cleaner glass. Fresh paint layered over old history like makeup over scars. For a long moment, he wondered if this was the answer. That the past simply vanished. That time erased people the way it erased ink. He checked the note again, smoothing it out like it might apologize for lying to him. The paper was thin now, fragile at the folds. He knew it by heart, every crease, every faded letter, but he read it anyway, hoping repetition would change something. It didn't, so he asked, at first politely, then carefully. Then with a quiet desperation, he tried to keep out of his voice. "Excuse me," he said to a man locking up his store. "Do you know if this address used to be here?" The man barely glanced at the paper. "No idea," he said, already turning away. A woman walking her dog shook her head before he even finished the question. Another laughed short, humorless. "Why would you want to know that?" she asked. That was years ago. Some people didn't bother answering at all. They saw the note, the seriousness in his eyes, and decided this was not their problem. Pain makes people uncomfortable when it doesn't belong to them. Why dig up pain? One man said bluntly, arms crossed like he was guarding his peace. Whatever happened back then, it's over. He thanked them all the same. He thanked them because he didn't know what else to do with rejection anymore. Hours passed. The sky shifted from pale gray to something heavier. Shops opened and closed. A city lived its ordinary life around him while he stood there holding a past no one recognized. Just as he was about to leave, about to tell himself that at least he had tried, he noticed a small shop across the street. It didn't belong to the present the way everything else did. The sign was faded, the window cluttered. Inside, shelves leaned under the weight of goods that had been there too long to be fashionable. The kind of place that survived not because it adapted, but because it refused to disappear. He crossed the street. A bell chimed softly when he stepped inside. Behind the counter stood an old man with a back slightly bent by time, hands steady despite their age. He looked up slowly, eyes sharp in a face that had seen too many people come and go to be easily surprised. "Can I help you?" the man asked. He didn't answer right away. He unfolded the note, careful not to tear it, and slid it across the counter like an offering. "I'm looking for this address," he said. "It's old." The shopkeeper picked up the paper, and then he stopped moving. His eyes traced the lines slowly, too slowly. He didn't shake his head right away. He didn't laugh. He didn't hand it back with a shrug. Instead, he stared. The silence stretched. Something in the room shifted. "You recognize it," he said quietly, more statement than question. The old man exhaled through his nose, long and heavy, as if the paper had taken something out of him. "This street used to be called something else," he said finally. "Long time ago." He felt his pulse pick up. The shopkeeper tapped the counter once with his finger, thinking. "She lived here," the man said. The words landed harder than he expected. "She lived here?" He repeated. The old man nodded slowly. "In the building that stood where that bank is now. Small place. Upstairs." He swallowed. "Do you remember her?" he asked. The shopkeeper's mouth tightened not unkindly, but with the effort of memory. "Yes," he said. "I remember her." "How?" The man glanced toward the window, at the street that had moved on without them. "She came into my shop a lot," he said. "Didn't buy much, sometimes nothing at all. Just stood there, like she needed somewhere warm to be for a few minutes." His fingers traced an invisible line on the counter. "She cried a lot." The sentence was simple, unadorned, and it broke something open. He didn't ask why, didn't ask when, didn't ask what happened. He didn't need details. That was all he needed. Because for the first time, the woman from the note wasn't a mystery or a ghost or a story people avoided. She was real. She had stood where he was standing now. She had breathed his same air. She had cried in public places because she had nowhere else to put it. "Do you know where she went?" he asked. The shopkeeper shook his head. "Not exactly. But people talk. They always do." He mentioned a neighborhood. Then another. Then a town name that didn't mean anything to him yet but would. "Try there," the man said, sliding the note back. "If you're going to keep looking." He nodded, afraid that if he spoke, his voice would fail him. He thanked the shopkeeper and stepped back outside. The street looked different now, not kinder, not welcoming, but connected. He followed the trail the only way he knew how, slowly, stubbornly, without guarantees. Across towns where no one knew his face. Through bus stations that smelled like exhaustion and coffee. Into neighborhoods where doors stayed closed and questions were answered with suspicion. He knocked. He asked. He waited. Sometimes people said nothing. Sometimes they said too much. He was told stories that didn't line up. Memories that contradicted each other. Names that almost fit but fell apart under pressure. There were days when he slept in cheap rooms staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was foolish, if chasing fragments of a woman who might not want to be found was just another way of hurting himself. There were days he nearly stopped. But then he would remember the shopkeeper's pause, the way the old man had stared at the note too long, and he would keep going. Through rejection, through silence, through the familiar ache of being unwanted by answers, until something changed. A name surfaced once. Then again, at a bus stop, in a whispered conversation, in a half-remembered story someone hadn't told in years. The same name, spoken differently, remembered vaguely, but repeating, until one name kept repeating. She lived in a small house at the edge of the city. It wasn't the kind of place people dreamed of when they pictured home. No white fence, no bright porch light, no warm laughter spilling out onto the street. Just a quiet structure tucked behind a line of tired trees, as if even the neighborhood had learned not to look too closely at what lived there. The road to it felt like it was pulling him away from everything modern and loud. The city lights thinned. The traffic softened. Stores became fewer, then disappeared entirely. The air changed, less exhaust, more dust, more damp earth. Even the sound of his footsteps felt too loud. He stopped at the gate and stared. For a moment, he couldn't move. Not because he was afraid of what he might find, but because he was afraid of what he might not find. He had carried this image in his head for so long that it had become a kind of religion. The door, the woman, the truth waiting behind wood and hinges. The closer he got, the heavier his body felt, as if his nerves were turning into stone. He lifted his hand, lowered it, lifted it again. His fingers hovered near the door, as if the surface itself might burn him. Then he knocked, once, twice. The sound was small, flat, ordinary, nothing like the thunder it created in his chest. Inside there was movement, slow, dragging, a chair shifting. Footsteps that belonged to someone who measured each step carefully, as if the floor might punish her for moving too quickly. The latch clicked. The door opened only a few inches, and a face appeared in the gap, half lit, cautious, older than he'd imagined, worn by time in a way that didn't look dramatic so much as inevitable. She was smaller than he expected. Her hair was streaked with gray, pulled back loosely. Her eyes were tired, not just sleepy tired, but life tired, the kind that comes from years of holding breath. Her mouth was set in a line that had learned not to hope too loudly. She looked at him the way people look at strangers who arrive with purpose. "Can I help you?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, rough around the edges. He tried to speak, but his throat tightened. All the words he'd rehearsed for years, angry ones, pleading ones, cold ones, vanished the moment he saw her. Because in that split second, he realized something terrifying. She was real, not a villain, not a symbol, not the faceless shadow he'd cursed in his darkest nights. Just a woman, older now, slower, standing in a doorway like she'd been caught in the middle of surviving. She didn't recognize him, not even a flicker. She studied his face, searching for context, for a name tag. For any reason, a man would be standing at her door with eyes that looked like they were holding back an ocean. "What is it?" she asked again, more guarded now. "Are you selling something?" He swallowed hard. "No," he managed. His voice came out uneven, like it had rusted from disuse. I'm looking for someone." Her gaze narrowed. "Who?" He reached into his jacket pocket slowly, and for a second, her body tensed as if she was expecting danger. He hated that. Hated that he was now one more stranger on her porch, forcing her to be afraid. He pulled out the folded note, held it up. Her eyes dropped to the paper. The moment she saw it, the color drained from her face. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't theatrical. It was immediate, involuntary, like her body recognized the truth before her mind could deny it. Her lips parted. She took one step backward, still holding the door, knuckles whitening around the edge. "Where did you get that?" she whispered. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. He looked at her and did the one thing he never thought he would do without shaking apart. He said his name. Not his birth name, he didn't have that. Not one she had written with love into a baby book. He said the name the orphanage had given him, the name that had followed him through years of being overlooked. He said it quietly, as if speaking louder might break the porch in half, and that was when she collapsed. Her knees buckled like someone had cut the strings holding her upright. One hand flew to the doorframe, but it wasn't enough. She slid down slowly, as if surrendering to gravity was easier than standing through the truth. A sound came out of her, not a scream, not a wail, something smaller and worse. A broken breath, a swallowed sob. A lifetime cracking open at once. He moved without thinking, stepping forward, crouching beside her. "Please," he said, and his voice shook. "Just please." She stared at him now as if she were seeing him for the first time, really seeing him. Her eyes tracked his face with painful slowness, like she was trying to match an old memory to a grown stranger. She didn't deny it. She didn't defend herself. There were no excuses pouring out, no anger, no attempt to push him away. Just a trembling woman on her own floor, staring at the consequences of a choice she had made in the rain. Her mouth moved as if words were too heavy to lift. Then she whispered, barely audible, "I thought you'd be better without me." The sentence landed like a blade. Not because it was cruel, but because it was human. Because it wasn't, "I didn't want you." It wasn't, "You ruined my life." It wasn't even, "I had no choice." It was a confession of fear. "I thought you'd be better without me," she repeated, voice breaking. "I thought, if I kept you, you'd suffer. I thought I would destroy you." He felt his whole body heat with something sharp. He wanted to scream. He wanted to demand every answer he'd been denied. To list every night he'd stared at a door that never opened. Every birthday he pretended not to care about. Every time he smiled while someone else got chosen. He wanted to say, "You don't get to decide what I needed." He wanted to say, "You don't get to leave and call it love." But the scream didn't come. Instead, something else rose in him, something older than anger. Grief. A grief that had been living inside him quietly for years, waiting for a face to attach itself to. His eyes burned, his throat clenched. And before he could stop it, he cried, not quietly, not neatly. He cried like a child again, like the boy who had once been left on a doorstep without even knowing what a doorstep meant. He covered his mouth with his hand, but it didn't help. The sound leaked out anyway, raw and shaking. Because all his life, he had believed he wasn't wanted. He had built himself around that belief, hardened himself with it, learned to stand straight inside it, and now he knew he had been loved. Not cleanly, not bravely, not in the way love is supposed to look when people tell stories about it, but still loved, poorly, fearfully, but deeply. They did not become close overnight. There wasn't a magical moment where the air softened and everything snapped into place like a movie reunion. No sudden laughter over coffee. No warm embrace that erased 20-something years in a single breath. What came instead was quieter, harder, real. The first few minutes after he cried, they just stayed there, both of them on opposite sides of the doorway like two people standing at the edge of a river, unsure who should step in first. She sat on the floor with her back against the frame, hands trembling in her lap. He crouched nearby, elbows on his knees, staring at the wet note in his fist like it might tell him what to do next. Eventually she whispered, "Come inside." He stood slowly, as if his legs belonged to someone else. The house smelled like old soap and dust and something faintly sweet, like tea that had been brewed too many times. It wasn't messy, but it wasn't warm either, more like a place that had been kept alive by routine, not by joy. The furniture was worn. The walls were bare, except for a few faded photos turned toward the wall, as if even memories were too heavy to look at directly. She offered him a chair. He sat, stiff shoulders high. His hands didn't know where to go. His eyes didn't know where to rest. He stared at the table, at the chipped mug she set down in front of him, at the way her fingers shook when she poured water. They were strangers. That fact sat between them like a third person in the room. He had imagined this meeting for years. In his imagination, he either walked away victorious cold, untouchable, or he found a mother who ran to him and made him feel like he'd been missing only days, not decades. Reality gave him neither. Reality gave him an old woman who had carried regret like a second spine, and a grown man who didn't know how to accept love without first checking for the price tag. The next day, he didn't come back. Not because he didn't want to, because he didn't know if he could survive being disappointed by her a second time. He returned to his cheap room across town and stared at the ceiling for hours, hearing her voice in his head. "I thought you'd be better without me." It sounded like an excuse until he remembered the way she had collapsed, the way her body had surrendered, like she'd been holding herself upright only to avoid the day she would finally have to face him. That night, he barely slept. And in the morning, he went back, not with forgiveness in his pocket, just with a question. She opened the door faster this time, like she'd been waiting in the same spot all night. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she stepped aside to let him in, and he walked past her with a strange kind of caution, like he was entering a room where the floor might collapse if he trusted it too quickly. They didn't talk much at first. They talked around things, weather, work, the neighborhood. Small, safe topics that didn't require them to bleed. He watched her hands while she spoke. How she held the mug too tightly. How she flinched when he said certain words, like child or home. He noticed the way her eyes kept drifting to his face and then away, as if looking directly at him for too long would be unbearable. One day he asked, "Did you ever come back?" The question landed like a stone. Her shoulders stiffened. Her mouth opened, then closed again. She stared at the table for a long time, as if she was searching for the least painful version of the truth. "Yes," she said finally. "Once." His chest tightened. "When?" "A month after," she whispered. "I stood across the street. I saw the lights. I saw them carry you inside." Her voice cracked. "And I couldn't move. I thought, if I walked up to that door, I would ruin you, or they would turn me away. Or I would take you back and still fail you." He wanted to tell her she had already ruined him, but the words didn't come. Because he heard something else underneath her confession. Fear. The same fear that had shaped his entire childhood, just from the other side. He asked other questions over the following days. Not all at once, not like an interrogation. Like a man tracing the outline of his own wound, why she had been alone, where his father was, what she had been running from. And she answered slowly. Sometimes she answered clearly. Sometimes she paused mid-sentence and pressed her fingertips against her eyes like she was trying to keep the past from spilling out all over the present. Sometimes she cried, silently, the way people cry when they've spent years practicing how not to. He learned she had been young. Not a teenager, but still too young to be as trapped as she had been. He learned she'd been threatened by family, by circumstance, by the kind of poverty that doesn't just take money, but takes choices. He learned she hadn't left because she didn't love him. She had left because she didn't believe love could protect him from what was coming. That truth didn't excuse the years, but it changed their shape. Forgiveness was slow, awkward, but real. Some days he hated her. He hated her voice, her smell, the way she said, "I'm sorry," like those words could carry time backwards. He hated the smallness of her life, because it felt like proof that she'd abandoned him for nothing. Other days he saw her laugh small and surprised, like a sound she hadn't used in years, and something in him softened. He did not move in. He did not start calling her mom. He did not erase the past. He kept his own apartment. He kept his own life. He kept his boundaries because he had learned the hard way what happens when you build your whole world around someone who might disappear. But he stopped running from it. He started visiting without warning, not because he wanted to catch her doing something wrong, but because he wanted to see if she would still be there. He started bringing groceries, fixing small things around the house, replacing a broken light bulb, tightening a loose cabinet hinge. Practical acts, safe acts, because emotional ones still felt like stepping onto thin ice. And she never asked for more than he could give. That was, in its own way, the first apology she gave him that mattered. She didn't demand closeness. She earned it, not quickly, not perfectly, but honestly. One afternoon, as he was leaving, she said softly, "I used to imagine you." Groan. He froze with his hand on the doorknob. "What did you imagine?" he asked. She swallowed. "I imagined you happy. I imagined you loved. I imagined you didn't remember me." He turned to look at her. She stood in the doorway, smaller than she had been on the first day, not because she had shrunk, but because he was no longer looking at her through the lens of childhood. He was looking at her like a man seeing the flaws, the failures, the fear, and seeing, somehow, that she had been paying for them every day. Because family, he learned, is not just who stays, it is also who regrets leaving. And sometimes healing doesn't come from answers, but from understanding. He was abandoned as a child, but he found something stronger than loss, the truth that he had always been worth coming back for.